Hello everybody and welcome to this video. It's the continuation in my series going through the New Testament. We're up to Matthew 8 and I'd encourage you to look at the playlist this video is part of if you haven't watched the videos so far. As always, please do give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment. It really does encourage me to continue. Just to say, I'm looking at the possibility of visiting some churches, either to speak to the youth group or the church itself in a similar way to the way I'm doing it here on YouTube. So if you'd be interested in that, do drop me an email, info@mrbruff.com. So Matthew 8, we've just finished the Sermon on the Mount, and then we have the continued story of what Jesus does after that. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." So there's a few things that I want to talk to you about with the leper. The first thing is that Jesus comes off the mountain that he's been up teaching the Sermon on the Mount to the disciples, and he comes back down to the multitude. So from the mountain to the multitudes, he's now with the public. He's not giving the specific teaching to his followers. He's with the public, and he goes around healing people. Now, leprosy is a disease that still has a stigma attached to it, but in Jesus' time, the stigma was huge. If you were a leper, there was no cure or treatment in this time, and you actually had to shout out from, depending on which way the wind was blowing, but around 300 feet away, you would have to shout out, "Unclean, unclean, unclean," to give everybody around you fair warning that you had this disease. People felt that touch spread the disease of leprosy. Actually, it's water droplets. And today we can cure leprosy, I believe. But in this context, it was very different. So just for the leper to come to Jesus, this would be the biggest social outcast there was. And look at the way that Jesus responds. He says to him, so he heals him, and he says to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." And I love this because what Jesus is saying is, in the Bible, in the Old Testament law, in Leviticus 14, in fact, there is teaching about the healing of leprosy, which at the time was an incurable disease. God had made provision in the Old Testament, all those years before, for the healing of leprosy. And there are these, these different laws to follow if you're healed from leprosy. So God is, some people say, oh, God in the Old Testament so grumpy and mean, and God in the New Testament lovely. That's not the case at all. It's the same God all the way through. And look at how Jesus responds to him. He touched the leper. Of course, at the time, they would have thought that if you touch a leper, you would certainly make yourself unclean ceremonially, but also, you would stand the risk of catching leprosy. But Jesus reaches out, and what a challenge to us to reach out to the outcast, to the socially outcast, to the people that everybody else would reject. As Christians, we should reach out to them, and that's a challenge. The next person Jesus speaks to is the centurion. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." And Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" And the centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one go and he goes, and that one come and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." Now, the first thing we need to understand here is, what is the centurion? So a centurion is a Roman soldier. You see them in recent resurgence of films about Roman life, like this one. A Roman soldier, and centurion, there's a clue in the name, because a centurion was in charge of 100 people. So he's a pretty high up Roman officer, a Roman soldier with 100 people underneath him in authority. Now, it's really important to realize the context, though, of the Romans. You see, we think of, well, the Romans were there and he's just speaking to them. But the Romans, of course, were the occupying army. They had come into Jerusalem, sacked Jerusalem, gone into the temple, laughed at God. They'd brought with them high taxes, paganism, real cruelty in their punishments. So in many ways, the Romans were the sort of enemy of the Jews, but Jesus doesn't treat him like that. So there's two sides to this guy. Now, he seems to be a good guy, okay, and lots of the centurions that are spoken about in the Bible are actually good guys. So it's not as simple as to say, oh, this is a bad guy. How do we know he's a good guy? Well, one of the things that's quite interesting is that he wants his servant to be healed. And attitude, to have that attitude to a servant as one you would want them to be well, shows this is a good guy. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, a few hundred years before Jesus, he said things like your servant is to be seen as no different to a possession that you own, and it would be wrong to sort of develop any sort of friendship with them. So attitudes to servants were very different in this culture, but this seems like a good guy. And this thing about authority is so interesting, because what he's saying is, look, I am in authority and under authority, and therefore I understand authority. And really what we can take from that is that we need to be ourselves under authority to understand the principles of being in authority. And it's a big risk when we talk about in the last video, the sheep in wolf's clothing, the false prophets. It's a big risk if you're not under the authority of somebody. It's important to if you're following somebody to realize that they are under the authority of somebody else, because else they can say or do whatever they want. Power gone mad is a common response from people who are not under authority. So having the situation of being under authority and in authority over people, he totally gets and understands what authority is, and says, you don't even have to come with me. Now, similarly, again, Jesus would be making himself ceremonially unclean if he went into the Roman soldier's house, the centurion's house, because he's a Gentile. But Jesus was happy to do it, just like he would touch the leper. But the centurion says, you don't need to. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. Now, what's all this stuff about, the weeping and gnashing of teeth, the subjects of the kingdom? It's similar to last week's video, or the week before, during one of the parts of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about, the idea that, the wrong idea that you're saved, that you're a Christian because you maybe grown up in a religious family, or, you have some kind of, you think, oh, because I'm English, we're a Christian nation or something. Jesus is challenging people here about the true nature of faith in him. And after the centurion, we have Jesus heals many, and it says, when Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. Now, two lovely things here. The first is about the contextual detail of women. Contextually, at the time, women were seen as far less important than men. If you had a baby at the time, people would be waiting. He would come out, if it was a boy, cheering, we had a boy, and an heir to everything. If you had a girl, you would come out very depressed. It was seen as a negative thing. But Jesus doesn't respond to that. He comes in and heals the woman here. So what do we see in the whole kind of three healings so far? We see a leper, the outcast of society. We see a Roman soldier who, okay, is high in authority, but is actually, part of the occupying forces of the area. Certainly wouldn't have been viewed positively by some people. And then we see a woman who, again, in society would have been looked down upon. Jesus heals them all. Okay, so those that Jesus heals here are looked down upon in society, and it challenges us to exclude nobody from our faith, to reach out to everybody. Can you imagine if we as Christians reached out to help the outcasts in society, whoever you might think they are? Because depending on where you're watching this, the outcasts in society will mean a different thing. But if we all did that, the world could not help but notice and take notice of what we were doing. Amazing. The other thing that I love about this, to do with the woman that he heals here, is that once he has healed her, what does she do? She got up and began to wait on him. She looks after him, perhaps, gives him something to eat or drink. And this is the natural response, surely, to, when God works in our life, that we want to then respond. When God heals us, when God forgives us, when God saves us, our response is to want to get up and serve him. And we've talked already in this series about that strange difference between, it's not that we do good works to be saved. God saves us, and as a response we want to do good works. And we see that here. She's healed and gets up to wait on him. When evening came, sorry if these pictures are making you a bit dizzy. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. And this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. Now, again, referring back to the prophet Isaiah, because Matthew, writing primarily for a Jewish readership who believed in the Old Testament prophecies but didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah, and he's saying, look, these are the proofs. He's fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies. Over 600 Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled by Jesus. This idea of healing, it's a mystery. God heals some people and not others, and it's a mystery of God, and there's nothing I can really kind of explain about that other than God knows, and God does what he wants to do, and we can trust in that. The cost of following Jesus. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Now this is interesting. The Message version, which is a kind of contemporary reading of the Bible, says something like, we won't be staying in fancy hotels, And it's quite interesting here, because there's something about this idea of you've got to count the cost of following Jesus. Okay, we're not staying in comfy hotels. We're not living in our comfort zone here. And there's something about this fact that Jesus doesn't just fit neatly into your existing life. So, okay, I've got this sort of, thriving business and a great family, and I love, these sports and this sports, and on a Sunday I'll go to church as well, and Jesus will just fit neatly in to everything I do. Jesus needs to be number one. And that is the challenge, not just fitting him into our comfortable comfort zone and kind of making him sort of fit in with us. It's about Jesus being the number one priority. Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." Now, this is a verse that a lot of people think, whoa, hold up, Jesus. A bit harsh. But we need to know the contextual detail here. This idea of "let me bury my father first" was a stock excuse, a bit like you might say, "Oh, do you want to come out on Friday?" "Oh, I can't, I'm washing my hair." It's a stock excuse. The chances are this guy's father probably wasn't even sick. It was just a sort of delay tactic, a sort of socially acceptable, polite, stock excuse. And now we're going to have a look at Jesus calms the storm. Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." And he replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Now let's have a think about this, okay? You're in a boat with Jesus. Sorry, the picture's a bit blurry. You're in a boat with Jesus. Jesus is asleep and there's a storm and you are petrified, okay? And you wake Jesus up and say, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. Now, Jesus says, why are you afraid? And then he stops the storm. Now, what I find interesting here is the structure. Okay, so this word then suggests that what we're reading came after what we've just read. Okay, so Jesus has healed a leper. He's healed the centurion's servant. He's healed the woman. Okay, in fact, he heals many. And then we get into the boat. Now, can you imagine seeing Jesus heal a leper? Okay. And then getting into a boat with him and being afraid of a storm. Jesus' response is fair, isn't it? You have little faith. Why are you so afraid? But of course, the metaphorical meaning of this applies to us today. We go through storms, okay? And there are storms in our life. Things happen. We go through trials, difficulties and storms. And we might be absolutely petrified, crying out, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. And we can pray anything to God, but God could quite rightly say to us, why are you so afraid? And I talked about this before with the look at the birds of the air and my tattoo and the altar that people build to remind themselves of the goodness of God. I think we so easily forget in our storms the past and how God has got us through every storm and how he's protected us and watched over us and never let us go through more than we can handle and all the rest of it. And I think this is a good reminder that whenever we go through storms, and we will go through them, that we should have the faith to remember, to look back on, God has got me through everything so far and he will get me through this. Now, Jesus restores 2 demon-possessed men. Again, this is a contextually heavy story that we need to understand. When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. What do you want with us, Son of God? They shouted. Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time? Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. Then the demons begged Jesus, if you drive us out, send us into the pigs. And he said to them, go. So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into the town and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. The first thing to understand here, because some people would think, oh, that's mean what Jesus did to the pigs, and he's ruining the income of these farmers and all that kind of thing. These are Jewish people, so it was illegal to be a pig farmer in this time. It was against the law. So this was an illegal activity taking place, which is why those tending the pigs ran off probably, because, they were afraid they were going to get in trouble. But what about this? When they all came out, don't you think they would see the 2 men who had been demon-possessed and be like, oh, this is amazing, what do we need to do to become followers of you? But they pleaded with him to leave their region. Now, there are lots of ideas. Maybe they did that because they didn't want the people farming the pigs to get in trouble. But I just think this is interesting because I think a lot of us believe that non-Christians, if they saw a miracle, would become Christians. But I don't believe that's true. In fact, I believe quite the opposite. I think, and not everybody, but I think some people refuse to believe in God because God doesn't fit into the way of life that they want to follow. So they want to be selfish and pursue their own pleasures. They want to sleep around. They want to pursue money. They want to just think of themselves, whatever. Okay? And it's easier for them to do that and to be able to say, well, God isn't real. But if you're faced with the reality of God, then how can you react? The way we should react, for example, the way these people should react is to say, wow, we want to follow you. We want to give our lives to you. But of course, it challenges us, doesn't it? When faced with the reality of God. Because like I just said before, we can't fit God neatly into our box. He won't just kind of fit into the lifestyle we lead. He wants to be in charge. He wants to lead. He wants to, take us on an amazing, exciting, beautiful journey. And for a lot of people, they would say, no, God, and they would plead with him to leave their region. So when you're a Christian and you're talking to people who aren't Christians, don't be surprised if you seem to be making progress, but actually this might be their response. Please leave. Because it's a bit like a bright light, isn't it? We saw about salt and light in Matthew, 5? We're the light of the world, and the light shines on the darkness, and you can see it brings to light the things that people are doing that are wrong, and it's a challenge. So some people, faced with the reality of God, would just say, please go away. I hope you found this video useful, guys. Please do subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. And email me if you're interested in me perhaps coming along and giving a talk or something like that.